coming tonight to Zikaron BaSalon. Just a few words before we go in. Zikaron BaSalon means remembrance in the living room. It is an event that was organized originally in Israel, and it was to sort of find a new way to commemorate what happened during the Holocaust and find a new way to have newer generations find it relatable and experience it for themselves. So first I would like to give a few acknowledgements to Rotem Segev, the Deputy Consul General, who is here today with us, and Sidney Zoltak, who is our survivor, who is going to be giving his testimony to us today. And I'd like to invite Rotem to give a few words before we begin.
Thank you so much. It's so heartwarming to see you all here. We started a project, I told Sidney about it, with the Holocaust Museum and the consulate to bring out the word and those stories for as many students and young people as possible. Because these survivors, like Sidney here with us today, unfortunately are not going to be here with us forever. And these are the critical years that we need to take advantage of the fact that we can hear firsthand those beautiful stories of survivor and about courage and hope that they can tell us. And now this becomes our responsibility to deliver those stories, to remember, to make sure that those things never happen again, and not to stand quiet when things like that happen. It's not have to be necessarily against Jews. It can be also against Muslims, against immigrants, against foreigners, wherever they are. And we should all make sure that we never stand still, because not so long ago, only 70-something years ago, it happened to 6 million Jews, and we want to make sure that it will never happen again, not even to one Jew, or one immigrant, or one foreigner that is not in the right position to shout out from themselves. So, Sidney, thank you very much for delivering this testimony. I'm sure it's not very easy to do so every single time, again and again, and remember those horrors that you've been experienced as a teenager. But I'm sure you can all find some hope with it, to learn that you can build a new life and a new family and a new future, and let's hold on to this. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming. For that.
I thank you very much for the introduction and for your comments, and for inviting me to this Hillel House to talk to you a little bit about my experience of surviving. I first want to tell you that this is my third time that I am in a program of Zikaron BaSalon. 2 years ago was the first, last year was the second, and I thought I was going to miss this year because on Yom HaShoah I will be in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and you can never be in two places at the same time. But I'm glad that I was invited, and I thank Hillel for inviting me, and Ben David for being the initiator. And before that, I just want to make a few comments for telling you my story. Is that Elie Wiesel made a statement quite a while ago. And what he said was that everyone who listens to a witness eventually should become as if they were the witness. So whatever you're going to hear from me, it's not Shoah education, it's not education of the Holocaust. I'm not a teacher. I am not qualified to do that. But what I am is a witness. And everything that I will tell you about my struggle to survive is 100% the truth. It's not what I read, it's not what I heard, it is what I experienced, what I witnessed. I am active in the survivor community in Montreal and elsewhere. I was many years a member of the Holocaust Center, the executive. When we built the museum, I was very effective there too. I became a board member of the Claims Conference, who negotiates with various governments, particularly Germany, about getting money for survivors who need financial help. And we're two of us from Canada. And I am busy with the functions of what I have to do as a board member. And I just finished serving as the president, the co-president of the Canadian Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, and I am now the immediate past president. So after telling you that I am active, and I have been active for many years, I will begin to tell you my story of how it started. I was born in a small town in eastern Poland called Siemiatyce, S-I-E-M-I-A-T-Y-C-Z-E. It's a little town that is called a shtetl in Yiddish, between the cities of Białystok and Warsaw. And the community consisted of 15,000 inhabitants, and there were Catholics, Russian Orthodox, and Jews. And the Jewish population of that community sometimes numbered 50% of the total inhabitants. So it was a Yiddish-speaking shtetl, as many of the other shtetls all around in Poland were very similar to each other. I was born in July 1931 to parents. My mother came from, was born in a village 20 kilometers away. My father was living in that city of Siemiatyce, and they had a store of ready-made clothes. As I went through childhood, my grandparents used to live in a village where my mother was born. They had a store of general store that catered to the local community of farmers and others who lived in the villages around. They had a very good relationship with the locals, and they lived there, and there were two other Jewish families there, but in a village there's hardly any kind of Jewish life. And when they wanted something more, they would come into the city. I had the privilege of visiting them very often. It's either my mother would take me there, or my uncle would take me there, and sometimes going by horse and buggy, he would let me hold the reins, and that was a special kind of privilege and also fun. And when I would come back and meet my friends, I would tell him my experience, how wonderful it felt and how much fun I had. I went to a Hebrew Tarbut school in the first grade. It was a secular school, and my parents wanted me to learn how to pray, so they sent me to a rabbi for lessons privately, so I can learn how to pray. And when I would go with my father to the synagogue, I could read and I could understand, and I felt an equal to the rest. We were not religious, we were secular in our thoughts, but the life in a small town, you either were an atheist or anti-religion, or you were a Jew traditional. And so we were traditional Orthodox, that my father would go to the synagogue, I would go with him, and we would celebrate all our holidays, and we were, and our neighbors and our friends were similar kind of traditional. The situation in Eastern Poland at that time did not remain the same for very long. That in 1935, the leader of the government, Marshal Pilsudski, died, and he was really a liberal man, and he discouraged the local Christian community from being anti-Semites, and he was considered a friend of the Jews. But after he died, the new leader had different ideas. And so the anti-Semitism started to be very visible. Before it was hidden and not talked about it. And I, as a child, did not really understand what anti-Semitism was, because all my friends were Jews, Yiddish speaking, and I really did not have to deal with any kind of slurs about being a Jew. And the young people, in spite of the fact that some of their parents would tell them not to do what they were doing, but they wanted to be in a group of popular youth, and to be an anti-Semite at that time was something popular. So they started to picket my grandparents' store, and my grandparents had to leave everything behind, went to live in the city of Warsaw, the capital of Poland. And we in our town, being under the Soviet Union, did not have the kind of harassment that on the other side of the border, which was a river Bug. On the other side, in the west, beginning 1939, the racial laws against Jews that the Germans had on their law books became a reality. They began to establish ghettos. They took Jews for slave labor, and sometimes would be never seen again alive. But we in the East did not have that. My school, my Hebrew school that I went to until 1939 became a Yiddish Soviet school. We had a director from the Soviet Union. He naturally was promoting Soviet nationalism, or a better word would be communism, and tried to turn us in to eventually become communists. In our town, the German occupation, with their racial laws, established a curfew for Jews when they could go out during the day. And you could only be seen outdoor a couple of hours a day. And we children stopped going outside because there was a police station across the street from our house that in the beginning we started playing outside in front, and there was a German policeman from Schutzpolizei, and his way of amusing himself and his comrades would be to let the German Shepherd dog chase us, and naturally we ran and we stopped going out. So we stayed indoors, and we were taught very early on that the mechanism of surviving, of being safe, would be for children to be quiet. We were not allowed to cough. We were not allowed to sneeze. We were not allowed really to be seen, because being seen, sometimes the Germans would use their rifles for practicing their efficient shooting. So we stayed indoors, and my parents were taken to slave labor duties. My father had a terrible job that he had to go to the border, where the border was, and there were bunkers that were built by the Soviets that really were not supposed to be, they would be strong enough to resist any kind of artillery shells, but the Germans used flamethrowers to burn the soldiers who were still there. And my father's job was to clean out those bunkers of the burned bodies. And he wore them out during the work. He went to the place of work, walking, and after he finished work, he came back and hardly talked, at least not that I can hear. So I didn't really know until after, much later, the kind of work that he was doing. And my mother was had a job in the fields that she had to have, like many other Jewish women. On August 1st, 1942, the Germans decided to establish a ghetto in my town. And a ghetto was really a holding place that the Germans would know exactly that the Jews were in one place, and if ever they had a plan what to do with them, according to the their plans, or what they call the final solution, they would liquidate these ghettos. So they established the ghetto in 1942 on August 1st. It remained that way until November the 2nd, 1942. 3 months later, the German occupational forces in our town were given the orders that it's time for our ghetto to be liquidated. As in 1942, in the fall, many of the ghettos that were established maybe 3 or 6 months before were being sent to death camps or concentration camps, or sometimes forced labor camps. The place destined for my community of approximately 7,000 Jews was the death camp of Treblinka, being only 70 kilometers away. So the liquidation began on in the middle of the night of November the 2nd. And my parents, including the other adults in our ghetto, and we were living in the ghetto the 3 months in a hut with 3 other families, including the president of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, who, unlike the larger cities, our president of the Jewish Council was chosen by the Jewish community and not appointed by the German authorities. And he was not only us, but he was back to become the president or the president of the Judenrat, reluctantly to help the Jewish community. He did that. And when we got into the ghetto, it was the president and his wife had asked my mother and my aunt and my grandparents to join them to be in the same house, the same hut. We were right near the barbed wire fence. And my father had a job in the ghetto that he was responsible for keeping the barbed wire without any kind of breaks. So he had the tools to fix, to give extra wire where there was an opening. And he also had the wire cutters. But in the middle of the night, and we children, were 4 of us in that household, they put us to sleep and with our clothes on, because the rumors were that there was talk about the ghetto being liquidated. There were foreigners that came to a number of Jews to the fans when they used to speak to them during the day before, to tell them that the Germans have ordered horses and buggies to come to the city from the villages, because the train station in our town was 7 kilometers away. So you really had to, it was too far to walk. So they needed transportation if they were going to take the inhabitants, the Jewish community, to the train station and bring them to the death camp of Treblinka. So my father took us in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, it was black, opened up some holes in the barbed wire fence, people started knocking on other doors to wake other people up, to tell them that this was happening. And then there was a lot of noise, a lot of running. He pushed me through and told me to run, that he was going to follow me. I was 11 years old and running all by myself because my father was waiting for my mother was waiting for her parents. And we lost each other, and I began running alone. And as the bullets started whizzing by, after the Germans have sent out some reinforcements of the guards that came to help the liquidation of the ghetto, but did not want to put the guards around the fence before the liquidation actually started. They were still in the German compound of the cities, of the established German government there. And when these guards came around the perimeter of the fence, they started shooting, and by that time we were maybe a kilometer away. And then I found my aunt and my cousin, who was 7 years younger than me, running ahead of me, and I caught up to them. I grabbed my cousin's hand and my aunt the other one, and we ran faster and finally got to a forest where during the day I eventually found my father, my uncle, and stayed there for a few days. As the adults were thinking what to do next, because while we were in the forest, the shooting stopped because nobody was running anymore. Whoever was running was either killed or ran away, and the rest was the Germans and their helpers, many Ukrainians and Lithuanians, their helpers, have taken the Jews to this train station, put them in cattle cars, and send them to the death camp of Treblinka. Within 1 week, 10 days, we were told later by two of our townspeople who managed to escape from Treblinka, and these were very few who ever did that, because that was not a concentration camp, this was a death camp. People were brought there for one thing only. And the one thing was to gas them and burn them. And they told us that it took about 10 days for all of the Jews in my community, maybe 50 were left, to do some chores that the Germans needed. And the rest were all murdered. And my father, who was with my aunt, were talking about if my mother was alive, and if anybody from our family was alive, they would probably head to the area where my mother was born and my aunt was born, to the village about 20 kilometers away. So we started trekking, and that was November, and it was cold and sometimes wet and dirty. And we started walking at night, and as I said before, we children learned very early not to complain and not to cry. And we went along and finally reached the area where we found my mother, my mother's oldest brother, and my maternal grandmother, who was lucky enough to escape after they killed her husband, my grandfather, with 12 other people who lied down to rest because they thought that she was dead because she was shot in her arm and she was bleeding. And she pretended not to breathe. She picked herself up and she walked those 15 or 20 kilometers until she got to the area where they lived before the war. And then started knocking on doors. And the doors that they knocked on were people that promised to help if need be. Because my parents and my aunt and uncle and also my grandparents gave away a lot of their valuables to some people in the villages. They knew, they were friends with, even some were classmates of my mother. But when we started knocking on the doors of these people, they did not respond kindly. And one of them in particular, I remember very, very vividly. We stayed there a couple of days and then we were told to go. And my mother was wearing a sheepskin coat. And the woman said to her, "Why do you need the coat? Leave it with me. I could use it. You're going to die anyway, so why take it?" And my mother told her in not very kind words that she is not going to give her the coat and she's going to fight and do everything possible to survive another day. So we left there, and during the time when we were hiding, she came back with her sister a few more times to the place to retrieve some of the valuable stuff that she gave away, and threatened the people there if they would not give. And I can tell you that the two women, both my aunt and my mother, were the force behind that mission to survive, and thanks to them, we were able to move on. We went to one place, and we went to another place, and we went to a third place, and sometimes we stayed a week, sometimes a month. In one place we stayed until the spring of 1943, a few months, and he wanted to be paid, and he was given all kind of stuff. And then one day he says, "You gotta go." So my parents and I decided to go first, and we ended up in a village, in a forest. And when we got to that forest, we stayed there a few days, and a young shepherd boy who was watching his cows came near the edge of the forest, met my father and spoke to him, and my father asked him if he would help. And he went and he got his older sister, who came to the forest, saw my mother, recognized her, that she was in our store, and my mother treated her with kindness and gave her a coat without being fully paid for. She remembered and she wanted to do something nice for my mother, including my father and myself. Went back to speak to the parents and siblings. And so that short time started, and maybe 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and it ended up being 14 months that we stayed in one place. And we had 5 different hiding places. And the last one was a bunker underground that we did not see daylight for 7 months. We would only be able to go out occasionally for some fresh air in the evenings. And towards the end, we would see the red sky. That was a sign that the advancing Russian soldiers were getting closer to us, because after the defeat of Stalingrad, I think it was in 1943, the German army was retreating and the Russians were getting closer. It's only a matter of time before they would come and liberate that area. But we had to struggle and hide in order to survive to live another day. And in addition to the Germans, who at that time did not really go out at night into the forests for any kind of raids, it's the Polish underground that were looking for Jews. They were not collaborators with the Germans. They were just anti-Semites that was inspired by the teaching of the Catholic Church in the area. And they looked for Jews in order to kill them. And one day they came, stayed 24 hours on our farm when we were in that bunker. And they couldn't find us. And so they left, and we were able to remain there. And in the summer of 1944, the month of July, towards the end of the month, we heard the Russians spoken outside the opening of our bunker. And so the men that we were with, as we started, 3 of us, to hide there, we ended up being 7. And the men forced that opening, that hole, and ran out. My uncle yelled to me, "Follow me." And the Soviets were there, helped us, but I ran for 1 kilometer and collapsed because I did not wear any shoes, and I could not stand up in the bunker that we were in. So my legs wouldn't carry me anymore. And my mother eventually helped me, carried me, got some help from the Soviet army canteens that they gave us a ride. And it took us about a week to get to our town to see who we could find from our relatives and friends. When we got there, the local inhabitants were not very welcoming. They wanted to keep our properties. The question that they ask is not, "Oh, it's nice to see you." No. They would say, "Ah, you're still alive." And we knew that was not a place to remain. They wouldn't even let us into our house. We had to go to live with my aunt and uncle. And eventually we started moving westward. We crossed borders of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, back to Hungary, Austria, and eventually I ended up in Italy, where I was there for almost 3 years. My father, who was not well after being liberated, after being free, he lost every member of his family. In Italy, in the December 1945. He died. At that time I was in the children's home from Noah, from Italia. There 9 months, but after my father died, I went to live in a DP camp with my mother. And because my mother had a family, brother and a sister in Montreal, there was no other choice but for me to join my mother and come to Montreal instead of going with all my friends to the land of Israel at the time. After being in the DP camp for 2 years, 1948, we arrived in Montreal. And I would not part with my mother. So I stayed on, and I made a life for myself, have a family, and very happy here. When we first came to Canada in 1948, my mother started working, and she corresponded with that family who saved us for the last 14 months. 1985, she wrote a letter addressed to Yad Vashem, which she never sent away, because that family, the people, the wonderful people, very religious Catholics, who saved us, did not want that their neighbors and friends would find out that they did such a terrible thing like hiding Jews. They were actually afraid because it wasn't very popular to have hidden Jews during the war. And sometimes the neighbors and sometimes friends became no friends. Used to tell that they did a sacrilege by saving Jews. But in spite of the fact that they told my mother that she should change the return address, her name, to a Polish-sounding name instead of the name that she had, my mother understood that their fear was real. And I was writing to the shepherd boy who got us out of the forest. And in 1997, he wrote me a letter, although I don't write Polish, but I understand and I read it. I had somebody translate the letters that I wrote in English. He wrote to me that I should come to visit because he would like to see me before he dies. He wasn't well at the time. And in 97, I decided that I would go. And even if I had to go alone, but ended up going with 9 more members of my family to a reunion that is hard to describe. We kept in touch ever since. And I went to Poland many times since I was going with my family from Israel, who came from the same town and wanted to know where their family came from. So I became a tour guide for them. And every time that I would visit that family, whose name is Krinsky, we would make speeches of the importance of accepting the prize of the Medal of Righteous of the World. And they still did not want to do that until in 2013. I spoke to the son of the shepherd boy, when I was in Poland once, and I told them that if we don't do it now, tomorrow might be too late. He went to his parents, talked to them, and came back to tell me that yes, he would accept that honor only if that presentation would be made in strictest privacy. No press, nobody from the municipality, nobody, outsiders. So in 2013, I went to Warsaw, at the Israeli embassy in Warsaw, where I received the Medal of the Righteous in the presence of the ambassador, Israeli ambassador to Poland, and the Canadian ambassador to Poland at the time. And I've been in contact with them ever since, and the 5 times that I've been on the March of the Living, I make sure that I see members of that family, that if I don't go to them, they come to see me. And I hope this year, when I'm on the March of the Living, they'll still be okay, that we'll be able to see each other, because we're actual family. So I consider that, and I speak to them on the telephone regularly. If I don't call them, they call me. And just a wonderful relationship. And the fear of somebody knowing that they received the Medal of the Righteous is not as bad as it used to be. And when you visit him in his house, the same farm that we were hiding in, he still lives there with his wife. He's very proud of it. He goes and he takes it out from the hiding place to show off that medal of the righteous, because they certainly deserve the honor of risking their lives to hide 7 Jews. I thank you for listening, and I hope you understand that what I have told you now is actual facts. And this is something that we survivors are the only ones who can say that we are witnesses, and after we're gone, hopefully you who have heard me can at least repeat some of the things that I've told you. By the way, I did not mention before, but I did publish a book, and in it I wrote a lot of more things, because some incidents, as it isn't easy, it wasn't easy for me to tell you what I did tonight. Some incidents I hardly ever speak to groups, because emotionally I don't think that I can handle it. So I try to play safe, if you understand what I mean. So this is, as a matter of fact, the glass of water is something that I use as a prop, and I use it to dampen my emotions. And it's never easy, but I know how important it is. So the conditions that one person can survive in is something that you learn from survivors, that will tell you that, hey, you think that this is a big deal? Nothing. Hunger, and my grandmother, who was hiding with us for a little while, would say that she has only one wish: to be able to go to a water fountain or whatever where there is water, to be able to take a drink when she's thirsty. That for her was more than being hungry. So these are incidents. These are not invented. These are not fiction. These are things that happened. You speak to people who were in concentration camps, they'll tell you what it was to be there for one day. And I read a memoir not too long ago of a friend of mine who lost every one of his family, and he had a Christian farmer to help him. He gave him some food occasionally, not to stay there, but he had to be in the forest. And he was in the forest for a long time, all by himself, all alone. We sometimes get bored. He didn't have anybody to talk to or listen. You can always pick up a telephone and speak to somebody. Nobody was listening. Talk to himself. And I was reading that memoir and I said, oh my God, what a way to survive. But the will to live another day was so strong that he did everything. And that is not something that that you can learn. You experience it. And then you realize what it is like. But people can live under incredible circumstances. And everyone, and I don't think that I've ever read a memoir, and mostly memoirs from friends, from people that I know. Everyone has got a story that you can learn something from it. If you pick up one thing, you've learned something. So, I don't know if I answered you, Jesse. It's everything is important. Everything is important, and look, I think that we who go out and speak, and I don't have to tell you, it's never easy. And going on the March of the Living, spending 1 week in Poland, for me, who was born in Poland, lived through the war in Poland, experienced Poland. Not easy at all. I stayed away for 2 years. I feel that I'm strong enough and I can contribute. And I have an obligation and a responsibility. And so I'm doing it. And I want to say that now, after listening to me, how you have a responsibility. But in a way, it's we all have to be responsible. correct? Or we feel that we should be responsible. We don't know we're responsible, but so if we feel that way, then it's a good beginning. So thank you for coming. Thank you for listening.